I'm afraid I have no exciting pictures. I particularly like that last one where they appear to have won a cuddly toy and some flowers. I want to go to that competition. As been said, I need to make a disclaimer that these comments are entirely my own. As was mentioned, I spent most of my life as a regulatory policy consultant for business and for businesses. I'm also a member of the Competition Commission, so I'm a regulator. I'm also a visiting fellow at Oxford, so that makes me an academic. And I spent most of my time in the consumer movement before doing that. And I have a Bristol City season ticket. So everything is, with that background, everything is very much a personal comment, because I'm not sure anyone I work for or work with would ever lay claim to what I think. I've been asked to sort of talk about barriers to entry and the problems with competition policy. And barriers to entry are for every regulatory economist. They just love them. Sunk costs and barriers to entry are just, they make you salivate even thinking about them. I'm going to try not to salivate, but make some comments really about where competition matters and why business should want competition policy, or why they should like competition policy. And I think the important distinction to make is between competition and competition policy, because there's very often a misconception in developing countries in particular that if you are pushing competition policy, you are pushing competition. And very often, actually, competition policy is about regulating markets. It's about controlling outcomes in market or stopping behaviours in markets. So it's not about unfettered entry and unfettered private control and unfettered behaviour. It's actually about controlling some of that behaviour. So competition policy has this rather peculiar role in a regulatory environment, in the sense that competition policy and competition regulators don't like to think of themselves as regulators. They like to think of themselves as creating the environment for private actors. But we can't get away from the fact that competition regulators do regulate and try and stop behaviour. So competition policy really matters in developing countries. When does it matter and when does it not matter? I once did some technical assistance training for the WTO in Africa, and I was asked a question by an official from a country I shall not name, who asked me, I think, the best question I've ever been asked in a training session, which was, how do you regulate abuse of dominant position in a civil war? How the hell do you... I think my answer was, well, you dodge the bullets and you just don't worry about the abuse of dominance, just try and stay alive long enough so that you can worry about it in 10 years' time. But we can get a bit like that as competition regulators. You get very fine-tuned about every little detail of the best theory and about market entry. But competition matters for, I think, some very clear reasons on new entry and foreign entry in particular. The first of which is, and it's going to sound a bit like one of these sort of, seven secrets of successful marriage, unfortunately, everything I wrote down here. First of all, it's sweetheart deals. We have endless sweetheart deals throughout Europe. You look at the car industry in particular. You have sweetheart deals where a country will pay someone to site themselves in a particular location, and they seem like a good idea at the time. They're good while it lasts. But it creates, one of the big problems with sweetheart deals is it creates either on the one part a sort of promiscuity on the part of the company that's being given the bribe, as it were, to locate, that they will just go somewhere else once that period has ceased, or an issue of dependency, that's not my phone, or dependency, where you get this sort of mutual reinforcement of money, essentially, and bribing to get into a position of continually getting more money back. And you see this, the interesting issue about Opal at the moment. I mean, I'm originally from Merseyside, and we used to go past the Vauxhall plants, and I always used to think, why the bloody hell is there a Vauxhall plant near Birkenhead? I mean, there's not many things near Birkenhead. If any of you know Birkenhead, you have my great sympathy. There's not a lot there, other than we had and have a Vauxhall plant, but it's not a place that you would normally stick a car plant. Go to Sicily and you find a Fiat car plant. I mean, Sicily, an island, nowhere, middle of I mean, it's, you get car plants in the most bizarre locations because of government control, because of government intervention, because of bribes, if you want to call them bribes, but kickbacks to sort of sweeten deals to locate things. The problem with that is that when the cruel winds of recession or the cruel winds of restructuring, or governments finally get out of the way of industries, those things disappear, because they have to disappear, because they're in the wrong place. They're simply not efficient. They're simply not sensible to run. The other, and I think the bigger problem, particularly for developing countries, and a lot of work was done this in the 80s, but I'm not sure whether it's ever been done since, but the beggar thy neighbour element of it, that some people can afford to pay companies to locate, their neighbours can't pay to afford companies to locate. So you get industrial location based on who's got the biggest, deepest pockets. not necessarily where the businesses should locate. And that, in a development sense, is pretty lousy. It's got nothing to do with the natural resource or the resource base of those countries. It's basically whoever's got the deepest pockets to pay the industry to locate. One of the other problems you can get with limits or controls on new entry and foreign entry is what you call partnerships, with joint ventures, requirements on joint ventures. A lot of those have been taken out by the last round of WTO agreements. You have shotgun weddings, essentially. The only way that you're going to get into this economy is if you form a joint venture with someone else. Again, there's problems there. Issue of controls. Who takes responsibility for the behavior of the company? And I think there's a real basically CSR issue when it comes to buying a company or buying control of something which you actually may not have control over. I think there's a real business problem there with partnerships. And then I think the deeper problem, which Karen alluded to, is a sort of the government business sort of codependency, which can become very problematic, because once you essentially receive payment for a certain activity, or the government gives you sweeteners, or you manage to negotiate sweeteners, or you get a carve out of a deal, it then becomes an awful lot more difficult to undo that. Once you've created this sort of dependency on regulatory control or regulatory capture, it becomes very difficult to undo that. And again, we've seen many examples of those over the years. You can point to entire industries. I mean, the Indian car industry is a great example of industries that have been protected for a very, very long period of time with very, very tight controls, producing beautiful but god-awful cars, if you like Morris Oxfords from 1940. But you open up that industry and it becomes very problematic for everyone, and you end up with a very, very complex mishmash of agreements. The third area where competition policy really matters, I think, for everyone, and it's an area which is probably best in inverted commas dealt with in a European context, is government procurement and contracting, because that is for anyone that's ever done any work on government procurement, it's a very, very murky area. General procurement practices and deals that are skewed to favour one producer over another are common almost everywhere. It's only in Europe that we attempt to regulate it in any realistic way. You don't find that particularly strong. You certainly don't find it particularly strong in the States, and if you don't find it particularly strong in the States, you can guarantee in most other countries it's pretty much gone. And so you find in government procurement that, there's a long pattern of cases of very bad deals where essentially taxpayers or the tax base in countries have paid for either non-existent projects, useless projects, have overpaid for projects, have not got delivery of things, because the process is failed. And there's a very, very strong case for controls over government procurement and contracting, and I think competition policy has a lot to say on that, and has a lot to say on injecting a degree of transparency in the contracting process. Now, that's not normally what we think of when we think about competition policy. We think of merger control and abuse of dominance, but actually I think particularly for developing countries, the most important role it has is actually transparency in procurement processes, because that's where I think some of the biggest problems are, and also where you don't see the issues. You don't see the fingers in the pies. There's a great photo. Very strange range of pies. You don't see pork pies and mince pies very often together. Very strange.
It was the Bristol City canteen.
It's a Bristol City canteen. No, we don't get that. We don't get sophisticated pies like that. It's a football club, for God's sake. It's a meat pie and a pasty, and that'll do. Anyway, sorry, where were we? Yes, and then again, I think a very, very important role, and I think this is it spreads between competition policy and, I think, regulatory policy, but barriers to entry, in inverted commas, entry for small businesses. So this is entry into the normal economy or the mainstream economy, because what you find in a very large number of countries is because the regulatory burden is ridiculous or the tax rates are so high, people basically operate in the non-mainstream economy, and so you see huge amounts of entrepreneurial activity, but it is outside the mainstream economy. It's outside of the normal system, and I think there's a real problem with having possibly the most vibrant part of your economy outside of mainstream regulation, outside of the tax system, outside of all manner of rules and laws that you may have. And a lot of that is because you simply have an overweening state that wishes to involve itself in absolutely everything and slow everything down to a crawl. And I think there's a significant role for business there in terms of its own ability to try and reform some of those processes. And I'm sure you've all seen the World Bank work on that over the years. But I think one of the strongest arguments for competition policies if you think, well, if there is no competition policy, if you do not have competition policy, what sort of economy are you trying to gear yourself up for? Firstly, new entry is difficult, if not impossible, or very expensive, because unfair barriers force you to either buy firms or basically exclude you entirely from the economy, and there are many examples of sectors which are dominated by one or two companies in many countries. Government contracting, the risk of corruption is huge, and that I think it plays off both. I mean, corrupt practices damage the country as well as the business, or the business as well as the country. Because if you create a culture of corruption or a culture of wrongdoing, it can actually affect other areas of work. And anyone that's ever dealt with companies involved in cartel activity knows the way in which the culture can actually permeate the rest of the company and create problems. And actually, I think one of the untold stories of competition policy enforcement is when you start to develop compliance programs in companies, it can change quite radically the culture of that company away from a fairly cozy operation which is much happier dealing with its competitors, and actually focusing it much more on what it should be doing, which is competing for the benefits of its consumers. And there are, unfortunately, unreportable examples of that, but you talk to anyone involved in compliance, and they can see quite significant changes in culture. The other big problem is if you don't have competition policy enforcement is you can stifle small business growth. And we know, from almost every economy that's where the most vibrant activity comes from, and you force them outside of the mainstream economy, and that's bad on so many levels. So why should business support competition policy? I never find this a particularly difficult argument. It always sounds like it should be quite strange, because most businesses actually do not like competition policy when you ever get to a regulatory battle, as it were. But that's because of a fairly simple public choice problem or a political economy problem. That the businesses who are most likely to make the most noise about competition policy are those who are most likely to lose if we get it. And so you will always find monopolies arguing against competition, because it's quite a sensible position to be in. If you are in a monopoly, then having competition policy which may force you to divest some of that monopoly power, you're not going to be very happy about. So you find in almost every economy, and this is not just a developing economy problem, that those who argue heaviest against or most vocally against competition policy will be those who have the most to lose. The ones who have the most to gain from competition policy and from competition, tend to be either too small, too disorganised, or too busy to lobby very heavily, and they tend to have a relatively weak case. And there's a great case in the UK where we had for many years talking about things like intellectual property policy and some of the business models developing around certain industries. That you'd always have the music industry will spend an awful lot of time and a huge amount of money lobbying government on IP policy. The games industry, who are incredibly vibrant and making huge amounts of money, are being incredibly experimental with the way they use their IP, are too busy, and they never turn up to meetings. You have all these great, huge forum where you have all of the IP owners turn up at meetings. Bloody games industry is off programming somewhere, or games testing, which actually is a lot more fun than talking in meetings. But it's a classic example of the problem of an industry which is very vibrant, doing very exciting things, very interesting things, simply doesn't have the resources or the wherewithal or the tradition of talking to government. And so it very rarely gets its point across, and I think that's actually, in a UK context, is quite depressing. So what is the fundamental question? I think the fundamental question is what sort of economy do we want to see, and what sort of businesses do we want to see? And there's an old friend of mine always used to argue that, well, competition isn't a natural state. Competition is actually not what markets do. Competition is actually an abhorrent state. You don't like competition. And that's sort of true. You don't actually, I don't like having to compete every day. I mean, you don't want to compete every day in everything you do, and it's a pain in the ass. You want to have a quiet life. You generally want to have a quiet life. Businesses, in a large, you have a tendency towards wanting a quiet life. And cartels, very often, when you look at the way in which they're organised, it's about having a quiet life. It's about organising things. It's about controlling things. It's about not competing too heavily. It's about dividing markets up. It's the incentive is not always the way that we often paint it in speeches in a pejorative way, that this is an attempt to rip people off. It's mainly an attempt to just have a quiet life and make sure that everyone can keep their shareholders happy and everyone can have a comfortable existence and go off and play golf on a Friday. It's rarely the sort of the visceral hatred of customers. It's much more the sort of quiet life. And so there's a very major tendency, I think, in economies to actually opt for a quiet life. So I don't think we should assume that competition is the natural state by any stretch of the imagination. So I think, when we look at the
the natural state of the economy, I think, is rarely competition. And we need to have rules. We need to have the toolkit to allow us to make the thing work. We also have a fundamental problem of bounded rationality amongst consumers and amongst businesses. I think we need to be very careful painting businesses as these wonderfully, brilliantly organised organisations that are trying to rampage around the world controlling things, because they can't, and that's just not the reality of things. They often find it very difficult to navigate how the world operates and navigate new countries. It's not a very simple process at all. And again, we need to ask, what's the natural state of government? There's very often this idea, and you see it in lots of discussions about development, that governments are naturally good at picking where their economy should go, and it ignores a political economy of political power and what governments are actually there to do. Are governments actually there to represent their people? Do they represent power coalitions? Do they represent the vested interests that have got them into that position? We need to ask, I think we all need to ask a lot more questions about the way that governments operate, particularly in developing countries, before we allow this sort of carte blanche for them to sort of do what they want. So with that, I shall finish. Thank you.